For centuries, Christians have had to deal with the dilemma of when to submit to earthly authority and when to yield to God's authority instead. Peter, the disciple of Jesus, for example, defied the ruling authorities when he was brought before the Sanhedrin to answer charges that he was refusing to obey their orders to stop preaching about Jesus. That's at Acts 5:27 and 28. Peter's answer was, "We must obey God rather than human beings," Acts 5:29. But a few years later, during a time of intense persecution of Christians, Peter told the early church members to submit to every human authority. That's 1 Peter 2, verse 13. Had Peter changed his mind? Does the Bible clash with itself on this point? Is there a way to resolve this apparent conflict? This is more than an issue of idle academic curiosity. The question of when to submit to authority and when not to remains a point of controversy for believers today as we face contemporary social and cultural issues. Jesus knew that the world would be at odds with his followers. He explained that believers would be hated by this world because they did not belong to this place. That's John 15:18 and 19. Jesus said believers who were conflicted by the world's standards were blessed. That's Luke 6:22. Given a choice between obeying God and obeying human authorities that directly conflict with God, Scripture seems to support adherence to God's ways, yet we are called to be obedient to worldly authority. When Peter wrote his epistles to the early church, he cautioned believers to live as free people, but not to use their freedom as a cover-up for evil. They were to live as God's slaves, showing proper respect for everyone, fearing God, but honoring the emperor. That's 1 Peter 2:16 and 17. For context, we should keep in mind that false charges were being leveled against the Christians at that time. They were charged with rebellion because they did not worship the emperor. They were accused of incest because they referred to one another as brother or sister. Yet Peter, as a leader in the early church, admonished them to quietly suffer, following the example of Jesus, who quietly endured death on the cross. Read 1 Peter 2, verses 21 and 22. If we quietly endure the ways of the world, wouldn't that interfere with our answering the Great Commission to go make disciples of all nations, Matthew 28:19? How could we be salt and light to influence the world if we simply abide by the authorities of this world? That's Matthew 5:13 and 14. Scripture requires both. Paul wrote that everyone is subject to governing authorities because there is no authority except that which God has established. That's Romans 13:1. He added, whoever rebels against the authorities is rebelling against what God has instituted. That's Romans 13:2. So how do those instructions apply in the face of today's pending legislation that would freely allow abortion at any stage of pregnancy, or that permit schools to counsel young students about changing their gender without alerting their parents, or requirements to allow males to share locker rooms with young female students? The answer appears to be a complete anathema to today's norms. We are to peacefully and respectfully advocate for godly standards. Defying the law is a last resort. We are obligated to defy authority only when we would be required to act in opposition to God's explicit direction. But this does not mean that we can quietly sit by while ungodly legislation is being considered. Christian believers have a duty to advocate for godly principles in our culture. We may be jeered, we may be lied about or disliked or slandered, but our duty is nevertheless to speak out. Moreover, we are to exercise that responsibility respectfully. Peter directed believers to live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day that he visits us. 1 Peter 2:12. We must advocate for godly principles while setting an example of decorum and respect. Striking the balance between compliance with authority while advocating for godliness is a tall order. How can we possibly live up to that expectation in today's world of hostility and name-calling and even violence? For starters, we must be secure in our own faith. Faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about things we do not yet see. Hebrews 11:1. We must hold firmly to the faith we profess. Hebrews 4:14. We must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea blown to and fro, tossed about by the wind. James 1:6. Security in our faith is bolstered when we are able to meet with others who share the faith. We are encouraged to spur one another on toward love and good deeds, not giving up on meeting together, but encouraging one another. That's Hebrews 10:24 and 25. Speaking up for God in the face of counter-authority need not be a solo mission. Christian colleagues are ready to stand for godly principles, and when two or more are gathered in his name, Jesus is present in their midst. Matthew 18:20. A cord of 3 strands, not easily broken. Ecclesiastes 4:12. So as we reflect on our proper response to divisive issues in our current day, consider these questions for introspection, if you will. Question 1, when is it appropriate to defy earthly laws? Question number 2, how should we submit to laws that oppose teachings of Scripture? And question number 3, where can we find the strength and the wisdom to fear God while honoring the government? As Christians, we are faced with a dilemma when duly appointed authorities label teachings from the Bible as hate speech or attempt to restrict public prayer or block meetings of believers. Yet we are called to peacefully submit, demonstrating Christian grace and respect for authority, following the example of Christ. Read 1 Peter 2:21. Only in the most extreme instances, when God's law is directly opposed by laws of human authority, are we permitted to violate law in order to adhere to God's calling. Peaceful and respectful submission, however, does not excuse us from promoting a more godly culture and laws that uphold biblical mandates. Jesus made clear that we are to serve as salt in this world, preserving godly standards for living, and we are to be light, showing God's way in every aspect of daily living. Read Matthew 5:13 and 14. Jesus forewarned that in this world we would experience trouble, John 16:33. Satan's dark spiritual forces are constantly at work, seeking to undermine Christian living. Read Ephesians 6:12. That's when we are called to peacefully submit to earthly authority while respectfully challenging standards that work in opposition to God's will for humankind. As Christians, we should be known for our respect of authority while peacefully working with one another to advocate for God's will to prevail.